Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Healing Words podcast. My guest today is Ramika Bingham Risher. She's an award-winning poet, author, and educator whose work explores identity, history, and legacy. Her newest book, Room Swept Home, delves into ancestry, womanhood, and resilience. A passionate advocate for the arts, her writing bridges personal and collective narratives, offering profound reflections on heritage and healing. Thank you for joining me today, Ramika.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so in your newest book, you start talking about two of your ancestors, two of your grandmothers, and the way their lives intersected without their knowledge, even back in Petersburg many years ago. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah. So my third paternal great grandmother, Minnie Folks, was born in Petersburg. She was born enslaved in 1859. She lived her whole life in Chesterfield County. And she was interviewed for the WPA slave narratives very late in her life. And within that same time frame, my maternal grandmother, Mary Knight, was taken to the Central Hospital for the Lunatic Insane up in Petersburg, and they were within 1 mile of each other. My grandmother was suffering from postpartum. She was only 18. She just had her first child. And there was, of course, no idea how to handle mental health issues in that time. And so it was just fascinating to me that they could be so close to each other in proximity, these two kind of disparate parts of my family line. And so when I found out that coincidence was too much for my little poet heart, I had to kind of write through some of those ideas. Yeah.
Okay, and that's a good point you raised because your work often interweaves personal and historical matters. I was taking some notes here because in one of your selections, you write about how you were born 8 days after the lynching of Michael Donald in Alabama. You're
Yeah.
connecting that.
Yeah.
And another one, you're connecting your church with the church, 16th Street Baptist Church bombing.
Yeah.
Is that natural for you? Do you do that in real life in your thinking? Are you
Yeah.
connecting your life with what is happening in the real world?
It's interesting. I was just talking to a group of middle schoolers about this, about how I've always been fascinated with the historical, but it really is the only way that I kind of understand how we got into the present. And so, like that Michael Donald poem you're talking about, it's 25 days after I'm born. I was really just looking for lines to continue the conversation that I was starting in Room Swept Home. And many of those conversations are obviously about race and about how we intersect in different ways. And I wondered what my parents were feeling, at the time that I came into the world and what was happening in the world that might have caused them joy, jubilation, and might have caused them real fear, because we all know what that's like as
Right.
parents. And so the Michael Donald story really, not only Michael Donald and his life being taken, but more fascinating was his mother, Beulah May Donald, that the poem is dedicated to, who eventually bankrupted the KKK and took them out of commission for decades for the lynching of her son. And to me, I was writing this book that was in many ways just an homage to mothers, just over and over, these women that continue to really care for and carry us in unthinkable times and ways. And so, that's how I kind of came to that connection. But absolutely, the historical is always my framework for the present.
Okay. You are a Cave Common Fellow,
Yeah.
and that organization is tasked with the artistic and professional growth of Black poets, making sure you're at the table, you're in the rooms, all of that. You also call yourself an Afro-Latin, am I saying it correct, poet?
Appalachian, you got it. Hmm.
Okay. And that, I'm gonna let you explain that, and then tell me how both of those, and if both of those affect the way that you write.
Hmm. Well, I mean, they're both organizations that, help us think about the ways that Black voices have been silenced, and making sure that there's a space for us, as you kind of carved out. Cave Canem is an organization that I came to many years ago in my journey as a young poet, and I've since gone back and taught there myself as a guest poet. And so, it's an organization that I love deeply, But it was a summer retreat, particularly at a time when there were this kind of flourishing of MFA programs or Master of Fine Arts programs where people could go and perfect their craft and creative writing. But those programs were in many ways, as reclusive as you could think of. I remember being in my program at Bennington and I was the sole, Black person in my class. There's one other fiction writer, Ada, who was in my class, a wonderful Nigerian poet who became a dear friend of mine. But I mean, we were far and few between. So many of the cultural things that we were writing about were just completely dismissed, like not to mention our craft. And so finding Cave Canem at a time like that, walking into a space with 50 plus Black poets and getting to spend a week writing in their presence kind of changed my outlook on, the ways that I discovered what was important in my work and in my life. And the Afro-Latin Poets is another poetry collective, much like the Dark Room, much like, many of the other poets that are coming out of this movement in the 80s and 90s, thanks to Nikky Finney and Frank X. Walker, who were thinking, even more specifically about the Black voice and the fact that, and when people are talking about Appalachia, they very rarely are talking about Black folks who live, in that region from Kentucky all the way up to Virginia. So they were thinking of ways to make sure those voices were heard. And so
Right.
that's, how that collective came into the world. And it keeps me thinking about those voices as well.
I'm wondering if you ever wonder how your writing would differ had it not been for these organizations. Were you before this? Were you feeling that you should change your writing? Was it really, really noticeable to you how different?
That's a really good question. No one has asked me that before. I will say this. I mean, Cave Canem in particular, and I think with Afro-Latin poets actually, gave me a community that was built in that I continue to utilize to this day. I mean, I was literally just texting a Cave Canem fellow, not an hour before our conversation. This was 20 years ago when I was there as a fellow. So these are people who have become like part of my living. And so I'm sure my work would have been different. But we were talking before we started recording about how I came to poetry, and I told you I won a poetry contest in the fifth grade. Well, that poetry poem was called Africa. I'm a Black princess, tall, dark, and strong. Like I was writing
Yeah,
about
you
heritage.
already there.
There was never a time when I wasn't examining, this kind of cultural, difference, this kind of shift in understanding. I was always thinking about what it meant to be certainly, just in this skin. But thinking about womanhood too, like those things have been steady in my work. Would I be as sharp a poet craft wise without those two organizations? Absolutely, positively not.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, you have written, I'm trying to carve out a world where people are not the sum total of their disaster. Unpack that for us.
I mean, it's a line in the context of many, but um, when we are writing about history and particularly when our lives are considered political just for being who we are, I often say, well, I'm not even writing political poems. I'm writing about my grandmama, but you think they're political, right? And I believe that really in the heart of me. But I also I want to make sure that people understand that we've survived because of the joy that we've infused in our lives.
Right.
And that, we can of course write about our difficulties. We can't pretend like it is not hard to walk through the world for all of us. Critical times are here for everyone. But I think for sure, as poets, we have the tendency to focus on the melancholy. And I want to make sure that I'm focusing on, the things that changed us and also the things that sustained us. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at with that line.
Okay. Okay. So this is not your first work. You are multi-published,
Mhm.
um, and you have awards as well. I'm going to go through I want to go through your titles and I want to talk about the meanings behind the titles because they're kind
Okay,
of evocative.
sure.
Okay. Conversion.
Hmm.
You won an award for that one. I'm going through my notes, so many notes. That was the winner. You wrote that in 2006. That was the winner of the Naomi Long Magic Poetry Award.
Yeah.
What We Ask of Flesh,
Yeah.
2013, that was shortlisted for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award.
Hmm.
Starlight and Error, there was the winner of the, is that Diode Book Award?
Diode. Yeah.
Diode Book Award. Soul Culture.
Yeah.
Um, I really want to talk about soul culture.
Okay.
Okay. Um, so you had, let's talk about your titles. Why did you title them the way that you did? Conversion, What We Ask of Flesh, Starlight, Soul Culture, Room Swept Home.
Hmm. I mean, all of them are very different, but conversion, ended up being there's a poem in the book called Adam's Conversion that came out of my graduate work. So that much of that book was like my graduate thesis, and then the last section kind of bloomed after I went to Cave Canem. But I will say, one of my beloved teachers who has passed away, Jason Schinder, was my thesis advisor. And he sent me back kind of all the poems that I had rustled up and put together for one of our first meetings during that thesis semester, and scrawled in blue marker across the front was conversion. So he named that manuscript for me. And it fit all of the things that I was thinking about. I said coming of age, a Bildungsroman, there were midrash poems and biblical works. So it just fit really well. And I'm really happy that I held on to it. It's a little piece of Jason there too. And so, the others come out of trial and error in many ways. What We Ask of Flesh. It's a long poem that's in the book, and it comes out of really, this question that ends up being ongoing about human nature. How much can humans take? How much can we heap on each other? And then
Right.
how do we, heal each other? And so, What
Right.
We Ask of Flesh came that way. Starlight and Air is a book of love poems about my husband and my kids. When we got married, it was Atwater instant family for me. I went from a house of one to a house of five. My husband, his two kids, my brother-in-law, everybody came and converged in the space. And so Starlight and Air ends up being a phrase in a poem, but really for me, it was just about the fact that, there's all this love and there's all this worry. So this is the yin and the yang of it all. So that's how that title came to be. And then Soul Culture, that's really just the tip of the title. The full title of the memoir is Soul Culture, Black Poets, Books, and Questions That Grew Me Up. And so that memoir was all about poets that I'd studied with. I interviewed 10 Black poets that I loved deeply over 15 years or so, and kind of wrote essays about what they taught me in the world. And it's a real Southern title too, because I figured if they let me throw poets that grew me up in there, then they knew the demographic that I was speaking to. And Room Swept Home is the most recent book. And really, there's so many reasons for that title, but some of it is just the poet in me. I love the sound of those, one syllable words together, Room Swept Home. Also, I think it's kind of a play on words, kind of a Jeopardy category where you get two meanings out of it, room swept and then swept home. Lots of actual cleaning imagery comes up. There's
Yep.
lots of, my grandmother was a domestic for many years. My aunts, so that it comes back to us, we don't have a whole lot, but we're gonna keep what we got clean. So,
Yes.
room swept home, and then, cleaning out the closet, getting family secrets out. So all those things
Mm.
come up. I think as a poet, we're blissfully tasked with, taking titles as seriously as every line in the poem.
Right, right. I want to back up a little. Let's talk about your awards.
Sure.
Um, are the awards as meaningful as the writing itself? What do the awards mean to you?
Absolutely not. I'm laughing because those awards are so few and far between as a writer. Um, and it's funny, you can get preoccupied, but if you do, baby, you'll never write. So the
Yeah.
awards, they're a glorious recognition that someone has seen the time and effort that you've put into, making something as good as you can get it at that point. And so I'm extremely grateful for any award that, I'm nominated for, that, comes to be. But the work is ultimately so much more important than that. And the craft, I mean, it takes years. All of my books, I'm a really slow writer, so all those books of poems have taken at least 7 years, to write, to think of, and conceptualize, and bring into the world. So, the joy is in the craft.
Yes.
Those awards are very few and far between and fleeting. So,
I would think the joy is in the unraveling
oh yeah.
of a concern, of an issue, the finding of an answer, and
Mhm.
even that is not enough. Getting it on the paper correctly.
Yeah. And for me,
Yeah.
it's not an answer, even though I absolutely know what you're going for. For me, it really is. I'm just articulating the questions as best I can. Poetry doesn't give me a lot of answers for anything, but it helps me really wrestle with all the things that continue to bind me up, right? To quote August Wilson. And so, it doesn't give me a whole lot of answers, but I love finding ways to wrestle with the questions because I'm asking big ones, of myself, of love, of God, of, all those things. And so, just a space to do that. And like you said, yeah, try to do it as well as I possibly can.
Right,
That's
right.
it. Hmm.
And only you know
Oh,
whether
yeah.
you succeeded in that.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Now,
yeah.
people will tell you if the poems are good or bad, but it's wonderful when they speak to people. But for sure, that you have to be clear that you've gotten things as clear as you can get them for yourself first.
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine having been conferred an award for a book and you know deep inside, I just wasn't, I could have done more. I
Oh,
just
yeah.
didn't hit it.
Oh no, poets don't. I will never speak for all poets. That's not true. But I was gonna say the poems don't feel like that. We feel like, woo, thank goodness. I worked hard and somebody saw it. And so that's I always appreciate, when someone sees the work, especially because, poets just as a genre, we're underseen in the way that certainly novelists are seen in a different light, and memoirists as well. But, if somebody takes the time to kind of really understand what you're working through in a collection of poems, they're making an effort to see you, and that's something that I'm eternally grateful for all the time.
Okay, I want to back up to Soul Culture again. That is your first book of prose, correct?
Yep.
The rest are
Mhm.
poetry. How did that differ for you? Did it come from a different place? Um, and then I want to get into the why of the
Sure.
writing after a minute, but let's talk about the prose versus poetry for you.
Yeah, it definitely came from a different place, but like I said, it started out as a very different book. I never set out to write a memoir. Um, I'm still shocked that I have a memoir in the world. Because like I said, maybe this was before we started recording, but I did an interview, I did interviews with Black poets that I loved for a great many years. These kind of long, birth to wherever they were in life at the moment interviews with just poets that whose work had changed, my understanding of the world. Sonia Sanchez, Lucille Clifton, A. Van Jordan, Honore Jeffers. So, it ended up being 10 poets that I interviewed over that time. And I thought that eventually I would just put all those interviews together. And those interviews, I would take them out on submission and they would be a book because, all these brilliant poets had smart stuff to say. And I realized that, oh, there are already lots of interview books that are in the world. So, maybe I should also just do, some kind of little essays about their craft. That's kind of in between. So, I would interview Patricia Smith and then I would write, an essay that really at the time was very much like something you might find in a literary journal. It's about her craft. So how Patricia Smith writes the persona poem and like what she does there, right? But not a personal essay. And so, when I was finally ready, and I wasn't really ready, it was when COVID set us all down. And I felt like, all right, I have nothing but time and space. I'm driving myself and my husband and my child crazy. So let's figure out what we can do with this book of interviews now. So I was very careful about who, I shared that work with and found an agent that I love and Larissa Mello Piankowski, who's still my agent. And we signed. She loved the book. It was wonderful. And she said, "Listen, I love everything you're doing here. Interviews don't sell. We have to rewrite the book. And so we commenced to, she said, you know, what really sticks out is when you're doing, you know, there are these little personal moments that show up in the essays. Maybe you could lean on those and you could think of this as kind of personal essays. And we can find a way to incorporate pieces of the interview. And so throughout that whole process, we kind of whittled it down. Then I found a wonderful editor, Haley Lynch at Beacon Press, a press that I really love. And Haley said, I want to work with you. This is amazing. We signed the book and she said, you know, this book still doesn't have enough of you in it. When do we ever get to hear enough of the Black woman's perspective? The Black women artist perspective in particular. And I thought, what in the world? This child, did she just say
We get
that we
here.
need to
Right,
hear from
right.
Black women? Right. Come on. And so I was shocked as I'll get out. But what that meant was I had to rewrite the book. So we rewrote the book twice before we actually got, and really what she was saying was lean into the personal, lean into, you know, what really speaks to you. And that's the stuff that'll speak to other people. And lo and behold, you know, they ended up being right in many ways. And so I still got to incorporate kind of this love letter to my elders, which was always the thing that soul culture was supposed to be. But it also ended up, you know, being a love letter to, you know, my family and a love letter to my parents and a love letter to all the people that kind of helped me progress as a writer, you know.
Right. I want to stay on this soul culture because didn't you have a mentor who kind of pushed you along that? Because this wasn't your idea to do this. I think I read in
Oh,
another,
Ethelbert
yes.
Miller was always the, you know, I interviewed Ethelbert. He shows up as the first interview in the book. He was also my first graduate school teacher. And Ethelbert, you know, I would just go crazy for writers and just, you know, Lucille Clifton. I was like, you've never seen anything like it. It's the most amazing thing. I could never do anything like her work. And long before Black Girl Magic, he said, you know, if you think Miss Lucille is magic, how in the world are you going to chart a path to her? How are you going to do what she's doing if you're so in awe of her that you think it's impossible to do the thing that she's doing? How are you going to make a life? And he said, you got to get out of this awe syndrome that you have for other writers. So now I'm going to make you interview them. So it was really his idea. Like he was like, listen, you know, you would be shocked how many, you know, if you put together a really nice letter and say, I'm doing these interviews, I want to publish the interviews in magazines, you know, I just want to make sure that, you know, these writers are given the time and attention that they want. And lo and behold, I didn't know any of those writers, and every single one said yes. Yes, they would
Every
sit
single
down
one.
with me and have an interview. Absolutely. And so because Ethelbert pushed me into that project, that really is the only reason that the book exists. So it's dedicated to him and to Cave Canem.
You mentioned Lucille Clifton,
Yeah.
who was twice a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm going to read what
one year, two books nominated in the same year and still didn't win it.
two books in the same year.
Yeah.
You were gaga over her. This is
Yep.
what she said about you. She said, she,
Yeah.
Remika, sees with a brave eye. Her story is a human story. Her sharing is an act of great generosity.
Yeah.
That must have done something for your soul.
It still does something for my soul. Miss Lucille, you know, and really, if you know Miss Lucille's work and get to know her work, if you don't, everybody please read Lucille Clifton. Um, she is even her poems, you know, we joke all the time that she only needs 4 lines and no punctuation to do what we need 4 pages to do. So she's
Mhm.
a woman of, you know, very few words, and she was really kind to me after we had done this long interview and gotten to know each other. And I told her I won a book prize, Miss Lucille, and I'm asking people for blurbs. I know you never do this kind of thing. And she read the book, and that's what she sent me as a blurb for the book, which was to me, you know, I was like, whoa, like sentences from Miss Lucille, multiple.
Punctuation?
Right. We just never imagined that she would take us that seriously. And she was really just, she was a gift to me. And her daughters continue to be a gift to me. They bought her house recently and turned it into a writing space for writers. It's called the Clifton House in Baltimore, Maryland, a house that they grew up in.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so, you know, the Clifton House, if you're anywhere close to Maryland or if you want to do some, you know, writing retreats, make sure you check out the space. Her daughters are brilliant folks too.
Your work is really, really evocative because there are things that I read in there that are germane to like almost all Black families, like the plastic fruit.
Uh-huh.
Didn't we all have that?
Come on.
Sitting still in
Yeah.
a storm,
Oh, yeah.
turning off the lights,
Let
turning off
God work.
all of
Right.
that.
Come on.
Yeah, yeah. Play clothes. You
Yeah.
like not wearing, we had two
Yeah.
different sets of clothes.
Absolutely.
Do you always have that imagery in mind, or does it come up in your writing?
Oh no, it comes up.
Okay.
Yeah. You live with it because you have memories that are deeply embedded. But no, particularly when you start writing family poems and for sure when I start thinking about and ruminating on place. So if I'm trying to think about my grandmother's house, her fruit bowl was actually fancier than most because most of us had the plastic fruit. Hers was glass on the table. She had this bowl of glass fruit and the plastic ones were in the kitchen. So it was really, it was like an air of sophistication in Mary's house. But I remember that. It's such a small thing, but
Mhm.
also, it says so much about care and the trust she had and all. I'm the 15th grandchild of 15. So, we used to run up and down that place, but anyway, we sure knew you better not break that fruit in that bowl. And so really, so many things that come back to us that we think of as like really individual. We're like, oh, this was cultural practice, and we didn't even know it.
You
But
didn't know it.
I live with those memories, but they don't come up until you start, thinking about specific things to highlight in the work.
Okay. I want to paraphrase two things that stuck out to me because I think it's something that we should have in the back of our head. Um, every lie told says there was no love between them, but I saw it everywhere I turned. And the other is there is nothing in your story that says that you should be here.
Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting that you would paraphrase those two phrases together. So the first is a few lines from a poem that's specifically talking about, all of this romantic love. Both of these grandmothers were loved deeply by their husbands. And no one ever talks about, how folks ran back to each other after dealing with the difficulties of being in the world. And I'm talking about, Minnie and her husband Thomas were married in close to 1900, 1910. I mean, they raised 11 children together, lost four children, and raised seven more. Same Mary and Johnny, same thing, seven children they brought into the world and were married until Johnny dies. And so, in the 80s. And so, I mean, it's strange that we don't get all of these love stories that also
Right.
happen, during those eras. And then that second line that you read is from a poem that I always give credit where credit is due that my husband made me write because I talked all the time that I was writing this book. Lord, I talked his ear off as I do, but particularly about these women and oh my gosh, like isn't it amazing? Like look at all of these. How is it that we're here? How have we survived? And look at all our family lines. And really close to the end of the process, like almost when I was in edits, he said, you haven't written that poem. Where's that poem about the fact that it's miraculous that we're here? And I said, oh,
Mm.
I gotta write that poem. And it ends up, being a poem that I read a lot from the book, but it really and truly is the poem that, lets me go back to that idea that I think the fact that any of us made it out is really tremendous.
Right, right. The pictures in this book, they're gonna grab your heart.
Yeah.
Um, there's one where you're standing in front of a door that says colored only, and we can see
Yeah.
you in the thing.
Yeah.
And at the
Let's
beginning
talk
of the
about
book,
it. We've never talked about that picture. Yeah.
yeah, let's talk about that.
I have the book in front of me. I'll try to hold it up so we can see some of the images. But um yeah, it's interesting that that photo in particular. One, a lot of these photos are family photos. A lot of them are personal photos that I took or that folks were kind enough to lend me. And some of them are historical photos. So it goes back in many ways. But that photo in particular, and I'm seeing if I can find it, was taken at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Just like everybody else, my family and I waited for years to kind of be able to get tickets. I don't know if you can see that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's it.
Waited for years to be able to get tickets. And then we were finally able to get in. We live in Norfolk, Virginia, so about 3 hours from DC. So we, took a weekend trip to take our children and to go. And so that's me standing in the frame and just taking the picture and just having the picture for myself. I knew that, I would want to remember, just kind of some of the moments standing there. And so it ends up, um, kind of being, a shadow in many ways of history and the things that I'm writing about. But that wasn't something that I thought would ever end up in a book. In fact, I didn't think any of these images would end up in a book, but I haven't had a book of poems that has images or has a big family tree that I had commissioned by these brilliant Black women artists. But this book merited all those things. It could not just be words. It also had to be a historical artifact. It was a family artifact. It called on images, not only of my grandmother's, but just of images that could help us track time. And so it's a hybrid text in many ways, and I really love books that end up kind of being a hodgepodge of many things. And I think images, that's why there's the saying that pictures a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think they can do, or help to expand our notions as we're reading, especially poems. So I wanted to make sure that if it was possible, images would be, kind of running all throughout the book. And fortunately, Wesleyan Press, they made it possible.
Excellent, excellent. Now, was it this trip also where you had to step out into a hallway and cry?
Yep, same trip. And so, if folks haven't been to Namak yet, please go to. It's a brilliant museum in the way that it's set up. But you go in an elevator, you start, and you can see years going down. You start in the belly of a slave ship, and you move up to the next floor. And there is a reconstructed slave cabin that they've moved from the South that sits in the middle of the exhibits. And so I'm just walking with my children and I'm very matter of fact, kind of pointing things out. When you walk in, there's this brilliant exhibit that's called The Paradox of Liberty. It's got, Thomas Jefferson and all these bricks that have his family names with the Hemmings and the other names. Oh, goodness. People that design these exhibits are so smart. And so, I'm pointing things out, but I had been reading so deeply and deeply in the thick of this work. That when I turned the corner and set foot into the cabin, I just broke down. It was a very different experience. It was, I could feel the weight,
Mm.
of history and also of, just the ancestors. And so I had to, I just turned my little self out of the cabin and just cried on the side, tried to pull myself back together for the kids and kept going, right? But and it was, the kids see me cry all the time, so it was nothing, but I was really overwhelmed. Like I couldn't even process, my
Right.
emotion or what I was thinking of in the moment. So that's why I had to get out of the way. I was holding other people up at the museum. So really and truly, it was one of those it's one of those spaces that it gives you a whole new way to process and think about things that, you've only been fortunately that you've only been reading about in your life. You haven't lived in your life, but you're thinking about the people who've carried you through that living.
Brian Stevenson came to ODU
Yeah.
a couple years ago,
Mm-hmm.
more than a couple, few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been to the museum?
Listen, it's so funny. You're the second person that's asked me that in a few months, and the first person I told no, I haven't, and I haven't for a reason. I don't think I'm ready.
I know I'm not. Not listen.
I have to pace myself, especially after this experience at Namak. I don't have it as of yet. I know I will have to go, and I know it will be an experience that kind of wrecks me in the way that it should. But no, I have not been to EGI's Institute. I have not been to the museum.
When he came to ODU, I had read Just Mercy and cried. I saw the movie and cried. And when he came, you would have thought that I just sat there. I know I'm not ready, particularly the
Yeah.
way that he explains it. I think there's something overhead.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and they list the names of
Hmm.
all known victims of
Victims of
lynching.
lynching, yeah. And they have dirt from some of the sites, and it's so thoughtful. I've read everything about the museum to try to prepare myself, but I still have not been able to, to cut my path there yet. But I know it's coming, and I just have to ease myself into it as we all do.
Let's get back to this your story here. Did you when you set out to reconcile these paths that cross
Mhm.
and to give homage to your ancestors, did you learn anything that surprised you, like really surprised you?
Oh, I'm sure I did. I mean, really, I didn't know much about now. My grandmother, Mary Knight, who was my maternal grandmother, who was sent to the insane asylum. She was a dear friend of mine for the latter part of her life. I was holding her hand when she passed, so we really knew each other. My grandmother Minnie, of course, dies in 1945. So 1945, roughly 40 years before I'm born. But my father's mother, Shirley Bingham, my nana, who I'm very close to, was born in Minnie's bed, and this was her grandmother that she knew until she was 6. So she's giving me all of these stories and making her very real to me. So that was a gift. But it was constant. I started this book by interviewing different family members just about, and starting with, what's the first historical memory you have? Tell me about where you work. Tell me about the regions that you were in. Tell me about this person. There was every day. The big thing that I think I learned that I was just shocked that we don't know is in this part of Virginia, in Petersburg, Virginia, we think slavery and we think cotton. So we think everybody was, picking cotton. Even, my dear family that's down in like Scotland Neck, North Carolina, which is where my grandmother Mary grew up. That was the first time I ever saw a cotton field when I went to visit family. So I thought, oh, I assume that lock, stock, and barrel, that's what's happening with the enslaved during
Right.
that time. But in Petersburg, cotton was not the crop, it was tobacco. And
Mm,
enslaved folks worked in factories. So they're apprenticed out and walked to factories each morning and stayed until dark and walked back to the plantation and worked in fact. So it was just a part of, tobacco being, a crop. And the fact that slaves are not just working on a plantation. These were not things
right.
that I knew at
That we
all.
know.
Yeah,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
that to me was fascinating. So I went down, a long rabbit hole. There's also a wonderful wonderful meaning. It's amazing that someone took it. Picture in the book of these women working in tobacco's big leaves. So, think of what you do when you're making greens, when you have to remove the leaves
Right,
from the
right, right.
stem, right? And so there's this beautiful picture of women that are, in a factory sitting, these black women, and it was taken in 1919. It was taken by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was taking photographs. It was visiting different cultural sites and taking photographs. So it's fascinating. But yes, there's so much of history that we think we know, and we just have no
We
idea.
don't know.
Yeah.
Going back to the picking cotton, I homeschooled my children, and me and a girlfriend, we took our children to Shirley Plantation, which is
Mm-hmm.
not too far from here. And when we rode up, just cotton everywhere. And so they showed it. Picking cotton is harder than we think it is. Why did I think it was, I don't want to say just, there was something to it. If your fingers
And there's
didn't get
thorns
tore up,
everywhere.
you were right, you were doing it wrong.
And also how light cotton is. The first time, I was like, please, can I pick a piece of cotton? Because I just need to know. So the first time I went out and I'm picking, and I'm like, I just don't understand how anybody would get 300 pounds of cotton of this wispy stuff.
Yes.
Like like you can't imagine that is something that you would be able to do in a day. But that is
Right.
what was expected of, human beings. So there's so much.
Your story, not your story, but the collection is several things. It's triumphant,
Mhm.
it is honoring, but some of it is also exhausting.
Yeah,
It's heavy.
yeah.
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 All of that together. But again, it is your story to tell.
Yep.
At the taping of this, we are 24 hours out from Mr. Kendrick Lamar's um,
His signature
halftime
performance,
performance
halftime
where
performance.
he was
Yeah.
telling a story.
A really smart story. Like we really got to give this kid credit. I shouldn't say kid, he's a big grown man, but really, like I think, people will be arguing about it forever, and arguing about what music he decided to play. But like, I mean, it was brilliant, starting with like the video game controller and Samuel L. Jackson being a rendition of Uncle Sam and talking through, this isn't how you play the great American game in the middle of like the biggest football game that's happening. It's layers on layers on layers on layers.
Game inside of a game, right?
Come on. It's just layers on top of layers. He's just smart, in ways that I think so many of us love, not to mention the fact that, like, as an art form, really, I was like, these athletes need to study this kid because he hasn't meant like he's spitting, his bars are so clear. And
Right.
the way that he's articulating is so clear, you don't miss a word. Now he's fast. So, if you're not used to listening to his cadence, you might miss something. But in the middle of that, it's still playful. He's still playing off of this, beef where he's kind of, taking down Drake, who thinks is kind of a culture vulture. There's so many things that are happening there that I was just really impressed that he managed to pull it off and thought through so many different pieces of the thing. It was good.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
to get it, you have to want to understand it. You have to,
Yeah. You got to pay
yes, you
attention.
have to
Now,
want
I
to.
live with teenagers, and so they help me out. But
I want to say one more thing about your book, and then we'll move on. Um, the more ground you cover, the more liberated you become, the more you have fears. And I think I am butchering that. But you have fear of your mind turning in on you, concerns about how your children are going to view you.
yeah,
Um, let's unpack that.
sure. I mean, it's from a sonnet. I'm looking in the book right now because it's really close. That poem in particular is somewhere really close to that image that I just showed. And so, yeah, oh yeah, there it is. Can I read it? It's really short,
Absolutely.
40 seconds. So here's the sonnet. The more ground covered, the more liberated you became. And it's important that title and all the titles in this Sonic Crown come from Sadia Hartman's book, Lose Your Mother, which is an interesting book in its own right, of course. I am scared my mind will turn on me. I am scared I will be naked in a burning house. I am scared my children won't outpace me. I am scared my children, who aren't made by me, believe I am a sad imitation of the others. I am scared I will gather in a room where everyone will ask me to remember, and when I don't lie, they'll say, I'd hate to be you. I've lived long enough to be scared my kidneys will give out on me. I've lived long enough to know just when they should. I have never shared my fears with anyone. I am scared they will map the land and take liberties. Will the women be ashamed? I'm scared to ask. What will live again? What will die with me?
Wow.
Yeah, I think in particular, so, there's this crown of sonnets, which is kind of one sonnet after another. It ends up being 14 different poems because each one takes the last line becomes the first line of the next sonnet. So you're creating this kind of braided scheme that happens. And so one, you have to find a way to make all of those sonnets very different, or it gets really boring for you as the poet and for you as the reader. But I felt like in a book like this, where I was telling everyone else's, what really in many ways were secrets. These aren't things that we talked about in the family. These weren't things that
Exactly.
came up. Most people didn't even know my grandmother was sent to the asylum. I mean, and these are people that lived with her. This was something she talked about with me very late in life. And the same thing with, Minnie. Minnie is talking in that, in her narrative about, how they tried to, how they raped her mother and how they tried to break her. And the women are the owners of other women, not the men. There's so many different things that we're talking about that are still taboo. And I thought, it is only, it's just fair to be brave enough to just say the things that you're frightened of that could break you. And so that's really where that poem came from. And really it's just articulating all the things, that now I know I have inherited. So I'm scared they're gonna come back on me.
Mm,
And what does that mean? And if I don't get this out, what dies with me if I can't make it work? And
right,
so
right.
there's so much there. And I think that's just fair. When you're telling, so many other histories and you're delving into the most difficult parts of people's lives, and some of the happiest parts of their lives, I think it's only fair that you show the balance in your life as well.
Exactly. Exactly. Particularly when in our culture and in our generation, what goes on in this house stays in this
Oh
house.
yeah, absolutely.
That that kind
Absolutely.
of thing.
Yeah.
What did you mean by fear that your children won't outpace you?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We just all want our children to do better than
Do
us.
better.
I want them to
Exactly.
have more than me. I want them to be smarter than me. I want them to have, real contentment. And that's what my husband and I are trying to teach them. I want them to be further away from fear than I am.
Ah,
Yeah.
wow. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Tell us about your job at ODU.
Oh, I get to help faculty think about writing and critical reading and reflection. I've been here for 13 years now. I'm also an alum. I was here for undergrad. But when I came in, it's to direct what is a huge initiative that's tied to accreditation called the Quality Enhancement Plan, where we get a chance to think about, designing a program that's going to affect a large swath of students. And we now at ODU, we got 28,000 students. So we got to think big when we're designing these programs. And so our last QEP was about improving disciplinary writing. It was, what kind of writing are these folks going to have to do in the field when they're in business and engineering and history? And what are we going to see? So we helped faculty design assignments for writing intensive courses that kind of linked back to their discipline. And now, we were looking at, all right, we've made all of these inroads into thinking about writing, but what do our students still need? And it's the foundational stuff. It's critical reading, it's analysis, it's a way to look at information and not be afraid to take it apart and think about bias and think about, ways that they might be given information and how someone might want them to interpret it in one way and how
Right.
they need to look at it in myriad ways. So that's what we're working on with faculty now, helping them design critical reading assignments and work on reflection with students so they can reflect on their own learning. It's a lot of fun. I'm in the middle of my faculty workshops for this semester. You can tell when I'm smack dab in the middle, I'm super excited about what we're doing. I got a really good group this time around.
Excellent. Wonderful. Is there a project that you're working on, writing wise?
Yeah, always. I'm working on a novel. It's written. I'm revising. I know, girl. Woo. And so it's written. It
A
actually,
novel, ma'am.
I
How
know.
did that come about?
That is the good question, really. It goes back to your question about was writing prose different from poetry. Like I said, I never expected to write a book of prose. I never expected to write a memoir. But after I did, I spent a few years like really steeped in prose. Once I turned in Soul Culture to my editor, there's a big lull in publishing. So you got, maybe 6 months before you have to do the other work. And I didn't have a huge project. I had Room Swept Home, but like I said, it takes me at least 7 years to write poetry. And so I thought, man, now that I've done something I just never thought I would be able to do, the one thing I've always dreamed about is writing a novel. So why don't I see if I can do it? So I did this wonderful, there's a great book, but there's all kinds of workshops and stuff now too, called the 90-day novel.
Okay.
And I did for, 90 days. I kind of sat down and I started at the beginning. And by the time I finished 3 months later, I really did have a working draft of the novel.
Okay.
So now it's been 4 or 5 years and I've been revising. I'm now at kind of, the strident revision and hopefully it'll be on submission to editors by the end of the year.
Excellent. Wonderful. And where can our viewers find you online?
Oh, they can go to Instagram. That's always easy. On IG, I'm just at Ramika Writer, Writer. I'm on Facebook as well because my grandmama's there, so I can't ever leave Facebook. So please, you can always check me out on Facebook because that's where all the family is. And I try to keep it to those two for now, because Lord, it can get overwhelming social media. So you gotta
Yes.
keep yourself at bay.
Do you have a website, correct?
I do. It's just RamikaBinghamRisher.com.
Okay, I will put that in the notes. Okay, so we are the Healing Words podcast, and at the end of every chat, I ask all of our guests the same 5 questions. It comes from the first letter of the word words.
Okay.
Okay, regarding your collection now, when did you know for sure that you were going to write this book? When did it come, move from a thought in your brain to let me sit down and start writing this?
Ooh, this point. I mean, at least the oldest poem in the book is at least 11 years old. And it's the titular poem. It's called Room Swept Home, and it ends up being the poem that closes the book.
It closes the book, yes.
That's right. But when I wrote that poem, did I know it was a collection? No. When my grandmother called me and said, "Hey, have you ever read that?" She called it a newspaper article. Have you ever read that newspaper article that my grandmother, they wrote about my grandmother? And I said, no, no, no. Like, if there were anything like that, I would have already been, they think of me as the family collector of stories. And so she said, oh, I'll have Aunt Rosie send it to you. And when I got it, I immediately recognized it for what it was because I'm a Black historian and think deeply about all of the collected pieces of our history. But I had read these narratives, these slave narratives, I mean, for years. And
Right.
so I knew exactly what it was when I saw it at the top, and I had no idea. And hers is Minnie's is anthologized in many places, like lots
Hmm.
all over the place, because she is happens to be talking to a Black woman, Susie R.C. Bird, who was a teacher in the area, but who was close friends with her daughter, so was someone she knew. So she gets wide open in this interview. She just says stuff that you wouldn't expect. I hope
Right.
the floodwaters drown some white folks, and I hope they drown some more. She says stuff that most people wouldn't be brave enough to say, and I believe it's because
In
she's
the
talking
interview,
to a
right.
friend, right?
Right.
Talking to a friend. So when I read that whole narrative again and realized that this was my great 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 grandmother, that's when I knew it had to be a book. She
Okay.
also, I can't make it up in the narrative itself. I'm gonna find it so I don't butcher it, because it opens Room Swept Home. In the narrative itself, she stops in the middle of the story that she's telling, and she says, "I just know I could if I knowed how to write and had a little learning, I could put off a book on this here situation." Now, wasn't she telling me I had to do what I had to do?
That was it.
I said, yeah.
Wow. Um, oh, organize. How did you organize your day to get this done?
I tell people all the time, I have to put writing and research time on my calendar, just like I put dentist appointments and grocery pickups and faculty meetings. And so, really, I have to set aside time or the time will just go. And so, fortunately, in the position that I'm in now, I have structured research time. So, one day a week, usually on Fridays, if I'm not teaching workshops, those are my writing days. And by writing, I mean writing, reading, revising, submitting. So I'm really spending that time. And then once I've got a full manuscript, then I'm kind of just in service of revision. And that takes a long time. I do maybe 30 revisions per poem at least. So that's the wrestling with the getting it right. And I do that in very small chunks over a long period of time. But I put it on the calendar. So if you're trying to find time to write, understand that time will elude you. You'll use it up with something else if you don't
Right.
prioritize it in the way that you prioritize other things.
Okay. R is for rear view, and that's because a lot of the folks that come here, they're writing memoir, they're writing something happened and their transformation and how they got over. And I always ask them, knowing what you know now, when you look back, what would you tell yourself?
Oh man. Well, I thought there was more to your question. What would you tell yourself? And then you
Yeah,
took a
yeah. What would you, so that's usually what I ask there.
Mhm.
Were there times during the writing of this where it just felt like too much, that you thought you were making the wrong um, turn? Knowing what you know now, what advice would you have given Ramika back then?
Um, I would say it's gonna take some time, but you're correct. Everything that you hope you'll be able to do, you'll be fortunate enough. Just give yourself time. There were parts of the process that were, of course, painful. I tell my students all the time, my students that are, studying poems and writing their own manuscripts and, doing thesis defenses. I'm like, I have never cried so much, during a process because, you are worried about legacy. And
Right,
I was really worried about, if these women, if I talk to these women tomorrow, what are they gonna say when they see this thing? I got to answer to them at some point. I believe deeply in seeing them again in the future. So when paradise comes, what am I gonna have to say for myself? Are they gonna be proud of the thing that I was able to do? So I cried a lot. But I would just tell myself it's okay to pace yourself and take your time. It's okay.
right.
Yeah.
Uh, D for delete. Was there anything so private, so concerning that you thought, I don't think I should put this in there?
Not really. I'm from the Lucille Clifton School of Writing, and she says all the time, when people are asking, man, those are some hard stories. Like, what is your family going to say? And she always says, it doesn't matter what they say. I ask the same question. Did I lie? I didn't lie. Then
There it is.
there is dead. You should have acted right. So, really and truly, no. But I wanted to make sure that there was real balance there. You know.
Yes, yes. Okay, the S. How have you been strengthened by the writing of this story in particular, the writing of this collection?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer, in the science of the fact that, what people endure is passed down to us. Scientists have been doing all of this work about, um, folks that are 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 generations removed from the Holocaust, and they still have, you know,
Genetics.
some of the, that's right, right. So I believe, I'm a firm believer that, much of this still lives in us and lives in me in particular. Um, and it reminded me how strong I am. I mean, we
Mm.
endured this thing. And if they can endure these things, certainly I can help my children endure what we're seeing today.
Right.
So that was, it continues to be the gift of thinking about these women in their totality, not just thinking about this one extraordinary event. But, they both lived to be 84. They both ushered children and grandchildren and great grandchildren in the world. They were both beloved in their communities and families. It doesn't get better than that.
That's it. That's
Mhm.
that balance that you stress.
That's
There's a title of a book out now, The Body Keeps the Score.
hmm
And
hmm
when I hear that, I always say, the body keeps the score, but I really believe our soul knows the answer.
mm
I just believe, and there was a scripture in here too that you
mm.
wrote down that God chose the foolish things to shame the wise.
That's right.
And I just really believe that
hmm
we are born knowing. Sometimes we
mm
have to uncover it because
Yeah.
it's just been tamped down, but
hmm
we're born knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so too. I think in many ways, we have the we have all of this information here laying in wait, and we've got to figure out how to uncover.
how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you so much, Ramika, for dropping by and chatting with me today.
Sure.
This has been lovely. I am going to make sure that I put your um, website in here so everyone can go out and check this book. It is wonderful. And I'm going to say, if you understood and loved what Mr. Lamar did last night, you're going to understand and love this kind of writing.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And I will see everyone on our next edition. Bye bye.